pretty full?
Yeah, still.
Yeah. Anybody done with their leftovers yet? We're down to soup, so that's pretty good at this point. We've all had a wonderful holiday. If I were to say to you today that today we're celebrating New Year's Eve, would that make any sense to you?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, so help me out, come on, why?
China?
Because what, China?
China.
Because it's China. How about something with the church?
Next Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent.
Because, and what's the first Sunday of Advent?
First Sunday of the church year.
First Sunday of the church. You see, Gina, I knew I could count on you to get a gold star. Thank you. This is the last Sunday of the church year. So I know it always is a little confusing because we're used to, of course, our secular calendar, and December 31st is New Year's, but this is New Year's Eve, but this is really the Sunday. This is our last celebration of this church year, is today. And so, like often happens when you're going to have a new year, you sort of take a moment and you kind of look back and you reflect on the year that's gone by. And what happens out of that reflection process every year, not a surprise, is that we remember about Christ the King, Christ the ruler, Christ who reigns, Christ who, through his example, has remade the world and offers us a different path and way of being. Christ the King, at the beginning of this year, this is year B in our cycle, A, B, and C, we read Mark. And in Mark, in the first chapter of Mark, when Jesus has been baptized, happens right away in Mark. You don't have any of the Christmas backstory stuff. Folks, you're lucky if you love Christmas that we don't actually celebrate Christmas in Mark because there's no Christmas to celebrate. What happens right away is Jesus goes out and the message that he shares is the kingdom of God is near, which is really could be translated as the kingdom of God, the reign of God is upon us. It's as close as something you can touch. It isn't something which often gets associated with Christ the King that just looks like now Jesus has made his way as Christ to the heavens, and in the heavens now he sits enthroned, triumphant, regal, and judging. You can hear that language in both the Daniel and Revelations reading today. And while it is certainly true that Christ has broken the bonds of how we understand life to work, and in so doing offers judgment and a remaking of the world, I would suggest this morning that it is worth remembering, just like you would if you watched one of those year in review, news segments, where they show you all the little clips of what built up for that year. I'd suggest it's worth remembering what that kingship, what that year of study looks like. Because it doesn't look like what you would expect a king to be. Rather than born of a king and a queen, Jesus is born out of wedlock by a woman who is a child, and to a man who will act as his father, who, folks, carpenter means common day laborer. Two nobodies. And this man who will be king is born not in the most sumptuous royal bed with attending nurses and lots of folks to care for him, but at night in a stable surrounded by animals, where strangers who spend their evenings outside are invited in to meet him. and then still as an infant, rather than standing up for his royal heritage, his family must flee. Flee to Egypt, just to preserve their lives. Not a normal story of a king, is it? Or how one would begin. And then, as the man who will be the high priest, where does he begin his ministry? Is it at the temple in Jerusalem, surrounded by all the other priests, and immediately risen to a position of power? No, of course not. He goes to the wilderness, as far away as possible, where there it is through a man who frankly the world would consider crazy, who wears rags and eats bugs and talks to himself and sits out on the edge of this river. And this is the place where God first talks to him and brings him into his ministry. And then when you think about the great stories of rulers, think about the people they surround themselves with. Other heroes, great leaders, titans of industry, the military, brilliant minds. But who does Jesus call to himself? Who do we know the disciples to be? Simple fishermen. Simple men who had led simple lives. And his kingship, which you would imagine as normal kings would be, is to the powerful and other rulers, instead is offered to the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the refugee. Rather than dining with other kings and potentates, he eats with sex offenders and corrupt local bureaucrats. And then, finally, when his story draws to its conclusion, as we remember and recall another year of Christ the King, his triumphant arrival in the city that will proclaim him as king is not through the front door, which is on the side towards the Mediterranean, not surrounded as Pilate would have entered at the same time, with royal guards, trumpets, and a procession leading him through on a chariot with a white horse, but simply among common people on the back of a mule. His last meal, rather than something sumptuous, is a simple meal with friends, which at the end he serves them by washing their feet. And when the last days come, he looks nothing like the kind of kings the world has offered us before. He is tried in a mock trial before those who have already made up their minds that his message is too dangerous to continue. He is not pampered and cared for, but rather scourged and mocked, forced to carry his own cross, the own piece that will be his death on his back, where instead of being surrounded as a typical king would be in their last moments by all their followers and beloved, he is abandoned. And only there, hanging, nailed to a cross, with two criminals on either side, in the dump outside the city, does he finally receive the written sign that says and is placed over his head, King of the Jews. Christ the King? To the world, he is Christ the failure. He is no one. You may or may not be aware that Jesus Christ appears in no other sources besides the Bible that we have at this time. He was not spoken of in his own day, or remembered, or known, except by those simple people that he lived his life with. And what does he say in our gospel lesson when he's asked by Pilate, "Are you a king?" He says, "The kingdom that I bring is not of this world." But really, I think that would be best understood, as we heard it in Mark, as looks nothing like the kingdoms of this world. Thank goodness we have enough of those. He says, "For this I was born, this kind of kingship, and for this I came into the world." As we get ready to celebrate Christmas and the coming of a baby, putting up the lights and singing the songs of happy expectation, are you ready for a new year? Are you ready for not just the baby, but Christ the King? A king who is asking us, if we hear his word and know his truth, to make a resolution to live first as citizens of that kingdom. Amen.